everyone, and thank you for checking back in with us. This is the Stevie Experience, episode 4, and today we have another very special. Along with our producer Mike Larkin, today is author Gil Martin, and he has wrote a fantastic book, or I should say, written a fantastic book, which is Ice Wars, chronicling the entire history of the rivalry between the Rangers and the Islanders. So, sir, thank you for coming on. We appreciate it. And I guess I'll start off with, before we even get into the book, because I want to talk a lot of hockey. So I'm going to have a lot to talk about. But first, I want to get your background about, for anyone who, has never heard of the book or heard of you, like basically who you are and what your history is and all that.
Well, I grew up around this rivalry, growing up on Long Island and, following this rivalry from just about day one. And, been writing about hockey for, probably about 10 years, working on this book for about 3 or 4 years. And, just to me, growing up, the way this rivalry has always been, if you're a fan of either one of these teams, you can't separate the rivalry from just hockey itself. It's sort of the core, the meat, the heart and soul of what it means to be a Ranger fan or an Islander fan.
Okay. So before I guess we go any further, I guess I have to ask you the $1 million. Who did you grow up rooting for, the Rangers or the Islanders?
I want to keep my readers and your listeners guessing. My hope is that, Ranger fans will read it and think I'm an Islander fan. Islander fans will read it and think I'm a Ranger fan. So, I tried very hard to be objective when I wrote this book.
Okay. All right. I like a little mystery. It's very good. You certainly kept me guessing the whole time. I was trying to figure out. I'm an Islanders fan, by the way.
Okay.
I don't know if you know. So I was trying to angle him, seeing where is this guy going from? I'm trying to think, but you really did a fine job of coming at it from right down the middle, and I really do commend you for that. And this, you said 3 or 4 years this took to write this book. This must have been a tremendous undertaking. Every game has a very well written. I actually have the book right here. I bought it almost immediately when it came out. Very thorough game summaries and statistics and standings, and for people who can't see this, and Mike Larkin, this is a very thick book. So this must have been quite an undertaking for you, because I can't imagine writing something this long.
It was a lot of work, and the way I set it up, I wanted it to sort of be like an almanac, a history. This is not just the history of the rivalry, although that's obviously the main focus of it. But you go through this book, and year by year, from the birth of the Islanders in 72, 73, all the way through the end of the book, you got a history of what each team did every year, who their statistical leaders are, what the big issues were facing the teams on and off the ice each year. So there's a lot of history here, and if you're a fan of either one of these teams, it's all in there. Stuff you remember and some subtle stuff that maybe you forgot, and all of a sudden it comes back to you when you look at the book.
It is a very, very thick book. There's like a glossary. There's the full standings of each, and there's obviously each playoff matchup is chronicled. It really is amazing. I'm curious. Did you interview players and coaches yourself for this, or did you kind of take it from news articles and stuff from the time they were happening?
I did both. I interviewed more than 50 players and coaches and broadcasters, some GMs as well. So I reached out to a lot of former players and personalities from both organizations. Guys were great with their time, very generous, got some really unique stories from the players I interviewed, and then I supplemented that with, quotes from newspapers and television and YouTube and anything else that I could get my hands on through research.
It's such a well done well-researched book. I mean, I can't compliment you enough for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this rivalry has been. They say it's been around since the beginning of really when the Islanders came in, but the rivalry didn't really heat up until the Islanders won in the '75 playoffs. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, until then, it was very one-sided. And, the thing is, you look back to that 75 playoff series, and even though both teams came into that series with 88 points, same final record, although the Rangers had more wins, everybody, absolutely every newspaper report, every television update, every prediction, the Rangers will have an easy time with the Islanders. The Islanders are still an expansion team. They're inexperienced. So, yeah, they came in with identical records of 88 points, but nobody thought the Islanders had a chance to win. And when the Islanders pulled it off, it's like everything changed overnight. And, one of the Rangers told me a story that, they would go into their deli and buy lunch, and their pictures would be on the wall. And after the Islanders beat them in that series, the pictures came down and Islander pictures started going up, and everything changed.
Wow. So, that's because that to me, it seems like that's really where the genesis of the mutual hatred started. Because like you said, it was one-sided, and the Islanders weren't very good before that. They were an expansion team. The Rangers were established. They had gone to the finals, and there were a lot of veterans there. And it seemed like once the Islanders made their mark, it almost seemed like there was a level of resentment almost from the side of the Rangers and their followers, because the Islanders, as it went on, season by season, get better and better and better, and the Rangers kind of spiraled after that. They really could regain the success that they had in the early part of the 70s.
Yeah, the Rangers had, under Emil Francis, they had 9 straight playoff years, and they actually defeated the defending Stanley Cup champions 3 years in a row without actually winning a cup themselves. And then the Islanders, the Rangers hadn't won a cup in 30-plus years, the 1940 jinx. And then the Islanders come out of nowhere, and in 3 seasons, they're, 1 game away from the Stanley Cup final, and they go on a run that's incredible. And they did it by beating the Rangers at Madison Square Garden in that best-of-3 playoff series back then in such dramatic fashion in overtime. So many things happened so quickly. And, yeah, the Rangers did not recover from that for about 5 years.
Yeah. So, so then it starts, and obviously it really hasn't cooled down since. I'm curious, though, what aspect of the rivalry is most interesting to you, either as a fan or an author? There's so many layers and so much history, obviously you know very well. What is the most intriguing thing, I guess, about the rivalry between the Rangers and the Islanders for you?
I think, you know what, the biggest surprise for me, especially among the old-timers when I was interviewing guys from the 70s and all, is just how much, as much as they disliked each other on the ice, how much mutual respect there was off the ice. And, there was a story that was told to me by Bobby Nystrom when I interviewed him, and he was in the hospital, he was injured, and who came to visit him in the hospital but Nick Fatiou? And so Bobby says to me, yeah, he brought me cookies, and it just,
wow.
Here's Nick Fatiou, one of the toughest guys in the league at the time, and a guy who always seemed to, he may not have scored a lot of goals, but when he did, he seemed to score against the Islanders. And, he and Bobby Nystrom, enemies on the ice, and yet he goes to visit him in the hospital and brings him cookies. So, the way these guys spoke about each other, and especially years later off the ice, so much mutual respect. And from that story that Bobby Nystrom told me, and then when I interviewed Barry Beck, he said he still dreams about playing the Islanders in the playoffs. So I asked him, I said to him, now, in your dreams, do you actually win this time? Because he never did beat them. He says to me, he says, I said they were dreams, not nightmares. So, I guess in his dreams, at least, Barry Beck and the Rangers did end up winning. But to think about this, that, 25, 30 years later, he's still dreaming about those playoff games, because there were some incredible games back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s between these two franchises.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's also interesting because people forget Barry Beck wasn't on the team in '79. He was in Colorado, I believe.
Correct.
So he missed that. And every year he was with the Rangers when they played the Islanders, they lost. And he was the captain for some of those years. So it's amazing that he was tormented by the Islanders probably more than a lot of other guys were, because at least the Maloney's and some of those other guys at least had 79. And they could kind of lean on that, especially when they, kept losing to them. But Beck didn't have that. And Beck was really like the heart and soul of that team at that time, right?
Yeah, and, they brought in Beck after that to try to be that last piece of the puzzle who was going to take them over the hump. And unfortunately, he never did. Came close a few times, but never did.
And it's interesting. So as the rivalry progresses and we go into the 80s now, obviously, 79 happens. And then the Rangers go to the finals and they lose to Montreal, but the Islanders start reeling off Stanley Cup. And the most fascinating thing to me was how, as good as the Rangers were, the season kept ending to the Islanders, and the recurring theme was always, you can never be better than the Islanders. You're good, but the Islanders are great. It seemed like the Islanders just always found a way, not just the Rangers, but all teams during that era, but it seemed they especially found new ways to kind of stick it into the heart of the Rangers and their fans.
It was amazing to me, that the Islanders and Rangers, the Islanders never lost to the Rangers in overtime in the playoffs. Never. And you look back at all these different games, even in 79, the games the Islanders won were in overtime. And, I talked to a few of the Islanders about that. And, to them, it was the attitude in that locker room. They were all sitting there saying, okay, who's going to be the hero? And instead of being, nervous or concerned or, oh, my gosh, what if I make the mistake? That was a very forward-thinking team. And who's going to be the hero? They'd been there by then. They had the experience. They'd done that. But every overtime meeting that these two teams had, and you go, the biggest one to me is the Ken Morrow goal in what I think was the best game of all time between these two teams, back in '84. But every overtime game in the playoffs went to the Islanders. They did somehow just find a way to get it done.
That's very true. I do also want to talk to you about 1984 because that was an all-time classic series. But for me, it seemed like the turning point of the rivalry when the 70s ended and the 80s began was the so-called quote-unquote double chili game at Nassau Coliseum.
Yeah, the double chili game is a classic, and it really ticked off the Rangers at the time, all the way up through management, and the fans, I think, were really the impetus behind it because they were chanting. They wanted the double chili. It was 6 goals for Chili, and when they scored 10, it was double chili at Wendy's for all the Islanders fans, and that was something special for them. And the Rangers were just angry, but they couldn't stop it, unfortunately for them.
It's interesting. Even without the Wendy's promotion, that game was very huge for the Islanders, especially because I believe it's the first time they played since the 79 playoffs, I believe. Is that correct?
I think so. And it gave them a certain amount of confidence because, people forget 79-80, which is the first year the Islanders won the Stanley Cup. They got off to a terrible start that season. They got off to a very inconsistent and slow start. And that game definitely was a confidence booster.
It definitely seemed like it was a statement game for them. It definitely seemed extra more to win that game. And kind of something that kind of gets lost in the shuffle, I think, about that game in particular is that John Davidson didn't play in that game because he was hurt. And that was kind of a recurring theme for the rest of his career. He just couldn't stay healthy, and he could never really gain that form that he had when he almost single-handedly beat the Islanders in '79. I think that was a huge loss for the Rangers not having a healthy John Davidson.
It really was. And they tried for years to get him healthy again. And they went through so many goalies, Eddie Neo, Steve Baker, Glenn Hanlon eventually. They tried to replace him. But when he was healthy, JD was a very, very good goalie. And he ended up, being probably an even better announcer. But, yeah, he single-handedly got them to that Cup final in '79.
One thing I am going to ask you about 1984, but just since we're talking about John Davidson, I think one thing people don't know about John Davidson is English is his second language. He is a Foster Hewitt Award winner, and he's in the Hall of Fame for English language broadcasting, and he's actually French-Canadian. French is his first language.
Pretty amazing, and he does a very good job, and now, of course, he went on to become an executive after that, but part of the Ranger organization for what, like 20, 25 years.
Definitely. I mean, he was as good as representative, I think, of anybody as what the Rangers were about through him being a player and as a broadcaster. So you can't talk about the rivalry without talking about 1984 because obviously I think you agree that series when they met in the playoffs in the first round, that's got to be one of the all-time greatest series I think in the history of not just New York hockey, but I think New York sports.
An unbelievable playoff series, 5 games, up and down, back and forth, some wide open games, some very tight checking games. The Islanders trying to keep their dynasty alive. The Rangers finally trying to get over the hump and beat the team they could not beat in 81, 82, 83. And they played 5 unbelievable hockey games, including Game 5, which is one of the greatest games I've ever seen, and I've seen thousands of hockey games in my lifetime.
It seemed like, at least the impression I get from reading about it, obviously, and watching the games, it seemed like going into that series, the Rangers felt that was their best chance to beat the Islanders because they felt that of all the years they played them, when they didn't win, that was their best team. Is that a fair assumption?
I think it is. And, the Islanders were starting to get a little bit older, and the Rangers had a lot of talent, a lot of depth on that team, and they really finally, at that point, were comfortable playing Herb Brooks' style of hockey, which was revolutionary at the time. And look at the 2 coaches in that series, Hall of Famer Al Arbor and the gold medal winner from the 1980 Olympic team, Herb Brooks. Great coaching matchup, great players on both teams, and just one hell of a series.
And I think one of the things that gets lost in the shuffle about that series, particularly Game 5, Game 4 also, but Game 5, is that Billy Smith almost single-handedly won that series for the Islanders. Obviously, Kenny Morris scored the goal that won it, but especially in Game 5, I think the Rangers were out shooting the Islanders at like a 2-1 clip almost the entire game, and Smitty just stood on his head for pretty much the entire game, and he had a huge save in overtime that pretty much saved their season.
He did. And, the thing is this, you look back at Billy Smith's career, if you go to his, hockey database page or any statistical website and you look at his career statistics and you're like, well, that's pretty good, but nothing, outstanding. But number one, he played in an era where teams scored a lot more goals. But number 2, the bigger the game, the better Billy Smith played. And he really did rise to the occasion in Game 5. The shots on goal were one-sided in favor of the Rangers. The Rangers had a couple of golden opportunities to win that game in overtime, and Billy Smith shut them down and ended up extending the playoff winning streak for a couple of more series as a result.
I mean, he was unbelievable that game, but so was Glenn Hanlon. Glenn Hanlon, I think, also was one of the things that made that game and that series so special was that Glenn Hanlon also stood on his head for the Rangers as well.
He really did. That, again, both teams in overtime overtime lasted only, 5-6 minutes, whatever it was. But both teams had so many great scoring chances. Hanlon had a very strong series, including a shutout in Game 2 where he made 45 saves to blank the Islanders at the Coliseum. So, again, the amazing thing that I've seen these games again. They're out there, and you watch them even now, and you're amazed at the high caliber of hockey that these two teams were playing.
I mean, really, it's unbelievable. I mean, I have never seen an Islander Ranger playoff game live because last time they met, I think I was 3 years old in the playoffs. But when you watch these, the footage and the highlights, it's unbelievable. Just the classic, like you said, the high level and the just absolute, balls to the wall. The intensity is there. It really is just. I get the impression that there really is nothing like Islanders Rangers in the playoffs.
It is an unbelievable thing, and the fans are so into it, and the players are. It was so intense. I mean, there were times where the Coliseum was just almost shaking because it was so loud, and the Garden, you could never hear the national anthem, especially when the Islanders were the opponent in the playoffs. It was just an electric atmosphere, and that's the kind of thing, going back to the beginning of this rivalry, that's one of the things that really made me fall in love with hockey.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, it's something special. I think we're lucky, to live in New York and to have these two teams that go at it. And even now when they play the games, it's still there's a little something extra there. It's never another game when the Islanders and the Rangers meet.
No question about that. And you know what? It's been since 1994 that there's been a playoff series between these two teams. But if and when there is another one, look out, because there was no social media in 1994. There was no 24-hour news cycle, or if it was in its infancy. To think about what it would be like now with Twitter and Instagram and all the things we have now that we didn't really have back then, the intensity level would probably be even that much greater.
Yeah. And it's a shame because since '84, they've only met in the playoffs twice, I believe.
Yeah.
And And so I do want to talk about '94 as well. But in 1990 is an interesting series to me for a number of reasons. But one of the main things that sticks out is that I think really for the first time since '75, the Rangers were viewed as having the better team.
Yeah, the Rangers won their division that year. The Islanders just sort of, sneaked into the playoffs. And right away in game one, you had just an immense controversy that took the rivalry a level higher even than you thought it would be. The first couple of games of this series just made it more intense.
Yeah, people, I think, when they talk about this series, they either they forget or they don't really talk about. That was a very violent and intense series, even though it was only 5. You have the hit on LaFontaine, whether it was intentional or not. Everybody says it wasn't intentional, so that's fine. But then you have the brawl to end game one, and then even in games, Jeff Norton gets taken off on a stretcher in game 3 as well. I mean, that was a low key. Intense and bitter series. I don't really, even when they played in the 80s, I don't really remember them being that at each other's throats throughout the entire series. I think for the most part, they would get together and they would actually play hockey. But that 1990 series seemed to be very intense and claws out and that type of a thing.
Yeah, it was very intense. And, game one, Pat LaFontaine, as you alluded to, got hurt, and a few Ranger fans were not letting the ambulance out of the Garden, and the Rangers hold on to win 2-1. Al Arbour sends out his enforcers, and all heck breaks loose at the end of that game. And again, a great coaching rivalry. Roger Nielsen for the Rangers, Al Arbour for the Islanders. There was already bad blood between those two dating back to previous playoff series when Nielsen was coaching Toronto and Vancouver against Arbour's Islanders. You had the Rangers-Islanders rivalry situation. And, in 2018, you can't imagine that much fighting going on in a playoff game, especially.
Yeah. There was the of the controversy, I think, for the brawl that ended Game 1, especially, was that I guess people from the Rangers side and some people that were following the series thought that the Islanders gooned it up to end that. But from my perspective, and obviously I'm an Islander fan, the Rangers took out the Islanders' best player. Whether they meant to do it or not, I mean, is almost beside the point. Because at that point, the Islanders have to have some show of, otherwise they're going to get pushed around for the rest of the series. So it was almost like for Roger Nielsen, how could you not see that coming? Nielsen sent out he sent out Bloomberg, and he sent out a bunch of guys that weren't really fighters, and he has the last change. Why wouldn't you kind of protect yourself and protect your guys by matching up against? I mean, the Islanders sent out Baumgartner and Vakota and all those guys with the express written consent to start a brouhaha at the end of the game.
Yeah, it seemed like as soon as those guys came out, everyone knew it was coming. And, Jeff Blumberg, who you mentioned, he was a born-again Christian who expressly stated, hey, I don't fight. That's not what I do. And he ended up getting beat up, during that brawl. And Chris King, who now works for the NHL, he came to his defense. And, I mean, you had an old-fashioned line brawl break out at the end of that game and all kinds of fines and suspensions, and the coaches were angry at each other after the game. I mean, it was an unbelievable circus at Madison Square Garden after Game 1, and the league had to warn both teams that they will not repeat that for Game 2, or there was going to be a big problem with the league office.
Yeah. It seemed like that was a very old school way of handling that too. I mean, Al Arbour was also a player, obviously, before he became a head coach, and he played during the 50s and the 60s, and it was a time where I felt like, if even if you mean to do it or not, if you're going to come at our best guy, you better expect some payback. And I think that's really the main reason why the Islanders, obviously, like I said, to show some might and to show they weren't going to get pushed around, but also just as a matter of pride, I think. I mean, I don't think that Patrick meant to kick out LaFontaine. I don't think it was that dirty of a hit. It was just an unfortunate incident. But at the same time, you can't get pushed around in a playoff series, or you're going to have a very early exit.
Yeah, I mean, that's the old school way of thinking, and a lot of people still feel that way. I remember, watching and covering Islanders games in recent years, and John Tavares would get checked, and people would say, "Hey, why isn't somebody going after the guy who just knocked Tavares down?" So, I mean, that's the old school way of thinking. You come after our best player, we're coming after you. I know it worked for the Flyers in the mid-'70s. Nobody touched Bobby Clark back then for fear of death by the Broad Street Bullies. Clark Gillies kept people away from Mike Bossy, and he was so big and so tough, very few people would dare to challenge him. So, that's a tactic in hockey that has worked for many, many years, and that's what Al Arbour fell back on in Game 1 when his best player got hurt.
Is it fair to assume that it's a longer series if the Islanders have LaFontaine? I mean, the Islanders that year were really only a one-line team anyway. Do the Islanders have a better, more of a puncher shot, I guess, if you will, if LaFontaine is healthy during that series?
No question. That gives them a better chance. I don't necessarily think they win the series, but maybe it goes 6 instead of 5. If they get a couple of breaks, maybe they can force a Game 7. But the Rangers were the better team that year.
Yeah, and one of the other underlying kind of unfortunate things about the LaFontaine incident is that he had a concussion when he got hit, and concussions ended up being a huge problem for him in his career, and he ended up retiring probably prematurely because of it. And that's, kind of an unfortunate backstory to that as well.
And ironically, where did he play his final NHL season?
The Garden.
As a member of the New York Rangers. So that came full circle. But no hard feelings from Pat LaFontaine. He never thought it was a dirty hit. And James Patrick just wasn't that kind of player if you look back at his career.
Yeah, I think it really was just a matter of bad luck, and I think that for all of the good luck I think the Islanders had during those series with the Rangers, I think that you almost had to expect that something wasn't going to go their way eventually. And unfortunately, that was one of the things you hate to see a guy go down like that. And one of the things that didn't go right for the Islanders.
No question. And then, like you said, it's concussions that end up ending LaFontaine's career prematurely. And, he's in the Hall of Fame anyway, but you can only imagine how many more years he could have played at a high level had he been healthy.
Yeah, no question. So we get to 94. I haven't talked about Dennis Potvin yet. We do have to get to Dennis Potvin. We can't talk about this rivalry without talking
no question.
Dennis Potvin, but I want to talk about the 94 series because that, of course, is the last time that the two teams met in the playoffs. I mean, the Islanders were just absolutely demolished in that series, embarrassingly. And, I mean, the Rangers were completely prepared for that series. I give them full credit. But, the Islanders are only a year removed from making the conference final. They have most of those players returned for 94. And I have to ask you, why do you think the Islanders got steamrolled so badly in that series? It kind of seems like it almost should have been more of an even series than it was.
Well, the one thing you got to remember is that the one of the players who was such a big part of 1993 for the New York Islanders was Glenn Healy. And he left the Islanders after that year and was now the backup goalie for the Rangers. So I think, losing Healy was part of it. The Islanders, look, the Rangers won the President's Trophy that year. You look at that roster top to bottom, and that was, the best team in the league that season. The Islanders, barely getting into the playoffs. And, the first two games at the Garden, it was like a tennis match. It was 6-0, 6-0, 6-love. And it was just kind of ugly looking from that perspective. And the other thing was this, with the exception of that one game sort of publicity stunt later on, this was the last game that Al Arbor coached for the New York Islanders, and you didn't want to see him go out in this kind of fashion.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the most unfortunate thing I think about that series was the unceremonious end of Arbor's career. But one of the X factors for me, especially from an Islanders perspective, in that series was Ron Hextall. They got Ron Hextall to replace Healy, and on paper, to me, it should have been an upgrade because, I mean, Hextall had a very good track record with the Flyers and the year of the Nordiques. He was considered one of the better goalies in the league. And then he comes to the Islanders, and you'd think that, the biggest, he was basically born to be the next Phil Smith. And he gets to the biggest stage in the series, and just he fizzles out. And he lets in a lot of soft goals, I thought. And just it was so uncharacteristic of him. And he basically got exiled from Long Island because of that.
Yeah, I mean, he wilted under the pressure in the first game. And I think not just that he gave up, 6 goals, but the way he gave them up, and you mentioned so many of those were soft goals. I think Al Arbor lost all confidence in him, and I think his teammates lost confidence in him after that game.
I mean, he was such an intense guy, too. I mean, do you think it really was just a matter of cracking under the pressure? Was there other things there where maybe he just wasn't into it as much as he should have been? Was there maybe you think it was maybe issues with mentally preparedness or anything like that? Or was it just he just could live up to his billing?
I think he just had a very bad game at the wrong time. And for whatever reason, on Long Island, his intensity level was not what it was in Philadelphia.
Yeah, which is, I mean, very unfortunate for the Islanders. I mean, they probably would have lost that series anyway, but to lose it the way they did and to have Hextall play the way he did, I think, was doubly hurtful for the Islanders because, again, it's the Rangers. You can't not show up for a playoff series against the Rangers like that. I mean, it boggles my mind, especially because he's such a good goalie and he's won a Conn Smythe Trophy, crying out loud. And then, you bring him here, and it's almost like he disappeared. It's crazy how was the X factor in that series for a negative.
And he won the Conn Smythe Trophy on a team that didn't win the Stanley Cup. So I mean, that's that's a challenge. But and he managed to do it. And yet in this series, the Islanders were outscored 22-3. So it was over before it began. And realistically, the first two games were blowouts, and Game 4 was really the closest one, where the Islanders had an actual 2-0 lead in the game before it all fell apart again.
Yeah. So I guess we'll talk about Dennis Potvin now.
Okay.
He is the it's probably fair to say he's the number one villain or number one character as far as this rivalry is concerned. He's definitely served as a villain to Rangers fans. I mean, he really embodied the rivalry, right? I mean, he kind of was this enigmatic figure who was big and dominant, and he was everything that the Islander fans loved and everything the Ranger fans hated. He was the perfect guy, I thought, to be the central figure of this rivalry for so many years.
He really was. And, you think about it, and I mentioned this in the book, the Islanders had the worst record in the history of hockey up until that point in their first expansion season. They played 78 games. They won 12. And they earned the first pick in the draft. Everyone knew Dennis Potvin was the pick. Teams made unbelievable offers to Bill Torrey for that pick. And he turned them all down, including Emil Francis. And the Rangers made him an offer, which really wasn't widely known, but I spoke to Emil Francis about it, interviewed him for the book, and we talked about it. And, as soon as Potvin came, the two additions the second year for the Islanders that made a difference, they had Al Arbor as their coach and Dennis Potvin as their centerpiece and their rookie defenseman. And the amazing thing about Potvin, Hall of Famer, great physical player and offensive player, one of the greatest defensemen of all time, but he saved his best games for the New York Rangers. And, if you think about 1979, the one image that Ranger fans all remember is at the end of Game 6 at the Garden, when the Rangers hold on for that 2-1 victory, there's that image on the television of Dennis Potvin slumped over by the Islanders bench, unable to even stand up straight from exhaustion and defeat. And after that, he didn't face defeat again at the hands of the Rangers again. So love him or hate him, Potvin was the lightning rod, the centerpiece of this rivalry for years. And the amazing thing to me now, obviously here we are, how many years after Dennis Potvin retired, 25, 30, there are fans who weren't even alive when Dennis Potvin retired who go to Madison Square Garden and do the Potvin sucks chant every game practically.
I don't think I was alive either when he retired, but every time I hear that chant, when they try to make that chant at the Barclays Center, I always try to yell over them and say Hall of Fame, because you don't see a Nilsson plaque in the Hall of Fame, but Dennis Potvin has one. So that's how I always felt about that.
Yeah, and that hit in 1979. You talked about the LaFontaine hit, and LaFontaine himself said it wasn't a dirty hit. Well, Ulf Nilsson, who was injured in a game in February of 1979, didn't think the hit that Dennis Potvin gave him was a dirty hit either. But I'll tell you, Ranger fans, that they never forgave Dennis Potvin for that. And Ulf Nilsson, who was lights out in the WHA and who had a very good start that year for the Rangers, was never the same after that injury.
Yeah. And it almost seemed like that incident really stuck with Ranger fans because, like we talked about Al Arbor being kind of an old school kind of a coach. Dennis Potvin, in many ways, was an old school kind of a player. He played mean. He always finished his checks. He would sometimes put a little something extra into it, and it seemed like the more time went on, and the better the Islanders got, the better Potvin got. It seemed like it was almost inevitable that he was going to do something to set off the people in Manhattan. And of course, the hit on Nielsen was the perfect storm of events, especially the time when it happened, the way that he took out one of their best players, and the fact that I think it was really a perfect storm of all around controversy for Potvin and the Rangers.
No question. And then the fact that he always played his best hockey against the Rangers. You look at his final statistics for his career, and as great as he was against anybody else, he really saved his best for the Rangers.
And I think largely because of that, what Islander fans know this, but I don't know if Ranger fans know, the Rangers tried to acquire Dennis Potvin 3 times. They tried to get him before he was even drafted. They tried to get him when Roy Bowe filed for bankruptcy, and they tried to get him during that 93-94 season when Mike Keenan tried to convince him to come back. I mean, for an organization that supposedly hates this guy more than life itself, they did try to get him 3 times. So he must have done something right in his career if you wanted him that badly.
No question he did something right in his career. Look, the Ranger fans, I'll say this, Ranger fans didn't like him, but if he put on a Rangers jersey and played even half as well as he did as an Islander, I think they would have fallen in love with the guy.
I mean, I don't really like to think about that, but well, I mean, it is really an interesting footnote to that history because of it being Dennis Potvin, and he's, all of Rangerland hates this guy, and yet they wanted him so bad behind the scenes. I think it's another one of the many layers. Like I said, there's layers to this rivalry, and that's another one of them. It's amazing how intricate and so many layers there are to this thing. And I think that's what makes it such a great, never-ending story, I think.
It is, and you talk about that chant after all these years, and that has got to be inadvertently the greatest tribute that you can give to an opposing player. That, here's a guy who's been retired, since 1988. So here we are 30 years later, and they're still saluting him, so to speak, every time these two teams play. And look, here's Potvin's final career statistics. And remember, he's a defenseman, not a forward. 83 games against the Rangers, so that's roughly 1 season. 28 goals, 92 points. Not bad for a defenseman.
Now, is that just regular season, or is that including playoffs?
I believe that's including playoffs.
That's amazing. I mean, it really is just the 24 goals is impressive enough, but also the assists. I mean, he definitely was one of the better first passers, I think, to ever play the game. I mean, at this side of Bobby Orr, anyway. I mean, he was the master of making that first pass out of the zone. I think that's where a lot of his assists came from.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I don't want to waste too much time waxing poetic about Dennis Potvin because I really could all night. But I also, on the flip side, there was also a yin to the yang of Dennis Potvin later on, and when Mark Messier enters the picture, he was kind of the Dennis Potvin to Islander fans because he was a lot of the same qualities that Potvin had. Messier also had. He was the captain. He was a big guy, played hard, finished his check. He would always get in the face. He never really did anything to the Islanders like the Nielsen hit. He definitely was someone, and also he brought the Rangers the cup and beat the Islanders in the playoffs. So I think that also had a lot to do with it. He was like the Dennis Potvin for Islanders. We don't have a chance for him, but I mean, it seemed like it was the same thing for Messier. He definitely a similar type of player. Is that a fair comparison?
It is a fair comparison. I mean, they played different positions, but those were guys who played were great offensively and also played tough physical hockey. Dennis Potvin, great hip checker. You knew you played against Dennis Potvin when you were done, and it's the same with Messier. You had to respect Mark Messier because just, of what he accomplished and the way he played, tough, fair, hard-hitting, clutch, and one of the greatest leaders, and I think both of them, great captains, great leaders. I remember the first time I saw Mark Messier, my very first trip into a NHL press box. I get into the elevator to go up, and there's Mark Messier in street clothes, and I'd only seen him in uniform before that, and I was amazed. The guy probably had 0.5% body fat at that point. I mean, it was just like someone had chiseled him out of stone.
Wow. Was he still playing at this time?
Yeah, he was still playing at that time. Yeah, wow. He was still playing.
And he is another big guy too, right? He was probably well over 6 feet. And at least 250, right?
Not so much 250, but again, just like all muscle, all just, nothing was wasted on his body. He was just very rock solid, tough, fit, and played the game the way it was meant to be played in a very old-fashioned sense.
Definitely. I mean, they're both, Potvin and Messier, I see a lot of the similarities because especially they're both warriors. I mean, these guys, again, like you said, old school guys, old school mentality, finishing their checks. I mean, you can ask Gary Kasparaitis if you thought Mark Messier was a clean checker, but definitely, I mean, so many similarities. Obviously, not a defenseman Messier was, but again, like it was. He definitely also because Messier won, Potvin won. They're both great leaders. And so I can't help thinking that those guys are almost on the same level, especially when it comes to this rivalry.
Absolutely. And, you think about it, Dennis Potvin, captain of the Islanders, 4 straight cups, 19 straight is unbelievable distinction. Mark Messier, you talk about the guarantee in the 94 play Devils. I described a speech he made during a game against the Islanders after they had won the Cup a couple of years later that was very important for the Rangers. Look, Mark Messier has done something that no other person has done since 1940, and now you're going back a heck of a lot of years. He took the Rangers to a Stanley Cup and won it. 78 years, 1 cup, and he's the guy who delivered.
Absolutely. And you talked about how Islander fans couldn't really fathom if Dennis Potvin crossed the border and went to Manhattan, but there is a little bit of a reference point to that because one of the more peculiar or interesting things that happened in this rivalry was when Brian Trottier becomes head coach of the Rangers.
Yeah, that was strange. It didn't even last a season, but it was a very strange situation. And, I think for fans of both teams, it just never felt right.
Yeah, it didn't look right, I'll tell you that much. It was very, very odd to see him there. And I think the thing for Islander fans that kind of, I guess, rubbed them the wrong way was how badly he wanted that job. I had heard that he had actually a multi-page letter or an essay to Glenn Sather about why he'd be a great coach for the Rangers, and he was taking it very seriously, and he took his interview very seriously, and he really wanted that job. And I for Islander fans, it was blasphemous, really. I mean, how Brian Trottier is one of the all-time ambassadors for the New York Islanders. I think that he even himself has said that when he goes around the North America and goes different places, he identifies as an Islander first and foremost, and for him to not just go to the Rangers and want to go to the Rangers, I think was real. That really I think was unique because there really wasn't anything else like that happened the other way around. I mean, Don Maloney at least was a player for the Islanders before he somehow moved upstairs to become general manager. I mean, I don't know how that happened, but that's the whole But yeah, I mean, it's weird now. It's almost like it didn't even happen now. Luckily, we can forgive him because he did so poorly. But yeah, I mean, that really is just. It was very odd. You're right. It was so odd.
It was, and it's almost better in some ways that he did not have success. Imagine if he would have coached the team for 5 or 10 years and maybe won a Stanley Cup. I mean, it just wouldn't have sat right with anybody, I don't think. But look, I did interview Trottier for the book. Very nice guy. And he was very serious. And I guess, part of it is this. Fans look at this a little bit differently than players do. Look, if you want to be a head coach in the National Hockey League, so we're going back to the 90s, maybe there were 24 jobs available. You don't get that many chances. So if an opening comes up and you think you're a good fit, it's hard to say, well, I used to work at Burger King. There's an opening at McDonald's, but my loyalty, there's only so many jobs out there if you want to be a head coach in the National Hockey League. It's hard to blame Trottier for going for it, but boy, did it feel concerned.
I mean, especially when you're talking about things like the rivalry between the Islanders and the Rangers, I think it's hard for fans to remember that at the end of the day, professional sports is a business. And the players, well, however intense they are on the ice and however intense things make, it is a job for them. They may enjoy doing it, but they're still cashing a paycheck. And it's like, like going to Burger King or going to work in an office somewhere for the everyday guy. I mean, athletes they get paid for playing a game, and we kind of put so much into what they do, and we kind of self-identify with them. But I think that was almost a good lesson, I guess, or a bad lesson, or depending on how you look at it, how sports really is at the end of the day a business, and that at the end of the day, loyalties can mean very little.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you work for Apple, that doesn't mean you can't later work for Microsoft, I guess, I mean, what could I tell you?
Although if you ask the Apple people, that's almost like a team in itself. They're very loyal to Apple, some of those Apple people.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. But it's not like there's fans and there's Islander and Ranger fans like there is in professional hockey. True. But so I only have a couple more questions for you. But you've been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on again. Really appreciate it. Looking ahead, obviously the book ends before we can get to the Islanders' former captain leaving and then everything that's happened and things that's going on this year. What's the context for this rivalry for this year and moving forward? Because it almost seems like with the at least for the Islanders anyway, with the Islanders starting to have a little bit of a leg up here now, which is kind of strange to say. All the intrigue with the Maple Leafs has been kind of distracting, and it's almost like things have simmered a little bit. What's the context, I think, moving forward for these two teams?
The thing is, this rivalry, as long as these two teams play in the same metropolitan area, this rivalry will live, especially for the fans. This rivalry is at its best when these two teams are at their best. And to me, the golden age of the rivalry was between 1975 and 1985. Those were probably the best years. And, for most of that decade, the Islanders were probably the best team in hockey. And the Rangers weren't that far behind, let's say, from 1979 to 1985. So you had just, when these two teams are great, playing good hockey, that's when the rivalry is at its best, but it won't go away anytime soon. And to me, if there's one more playoff series between these two teams, to quote Spinal Tap, this thing will go back up to 11 in a hurry.
It almost seems like also that it won't take much to kind of bring things back up a little bit. It only really would take maybe, one hit or one, big goal, and then we'll be right back on track. I mean, it doesn't seem like we're really that far off from going full bore again as we were a couple of years ago even.
No, I agree. And, the ironic thing is, as much as Barclays Center has been a mixed bag for the Islanders at best, with the obstructed view seats and the quality of the ice and the commute for a lot of fans, But one thing about Barclays Center, the Rangers can't win there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, the Islanders want to get out of there. I think with that being said, they should probably take their time. I certainly wouldn't mind. My last question is a hypothetical one, and this is just your opinion now. It doesn't have factual or anything like that. But let's take the two winning teams. They take the 82 Islanders and the 94 Rangers. If they were to meet in a game, like a pickup game or a one-game win, who do you think comes out on the winning end in a matchup between the Dynasty-era Islanders and the Messier-era Rangers?
Wow, that's a darn good question. It's tough to answer that for a one-game meeting. For a 7-game series, I would give the Islanders a slight edge only because of this. The 94 Rangers were an older team, and I think over a 7-game series, they might have worn down just a little bit. Richter and Smith were both clutch goalies who played their best when the stakes were the highest. But I think, the Rangers made so many trades for older ex-Oilers and a couple of, older veterans to fortify that team at the trade deadline. And I think the Islanders would have had an edge because they were a little bit younger and a little bit more balanced. But I'm splitting hairs. Those are two great teams, two teams for the ages.
The biggest thing for me, I think, and I thought about it obviously before I came on when I was writing it down, the biggest differentiates the two teams for me was the teams were built to win long term, while the Rangers in '94 were really only built to win that 1 year.
Yep, no question about that. No question about that. But you look down those rosters, and both teams had, players who people don't necessarily remember a lot, but who were big contributors. Who was the leading scorer of the 1994 New York Rangers? Very few people know the correct answer to this question. It was Sergei Zubov, and
yes.
Everyone remembers Brian Leach, and Brian Leach, deservedly a Hall of Famer. But Zubov was the leading scorer on that team, and what a great second offensive defenseman he was. The Islanders had guys like, Stefan Pearson and, just players on the second defensive pairing or the second or third line who could come up and score goals in the clutch and be difference makers on those teams. So, I'll tell you something. If they played 7 games, that'd be a heck of a series.
It would be. But there's one guy who would know better than anyone, and that's Greg Gilbert.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did you get to talk to Greg Gilbert at all when you were?
I did not get to talk to Greg Gilbert. Unfortunately, no.
You definitely would have liked it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I did speak now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I did speak to a number of people who played for both teams. I spoke to Don Maloney, and he was the biggest one because obviously, he was a assistant general manager with the Rangers, general manager with the Islanders, played for both teams. Patrick Flatley played for both teams. I spoke to him. So, yeah, I tell you, but Greg Gilbert won a cup with both teams, and I believe he's the only player with that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to get his thoughts on that because he is the only player in history from both teams. So I think, if I ever got talked to him, that's the one question that I would ask him because he would know better than anyone, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me, and I really do appreciate it. Do you do social media and all that stuff? Is there places where people can, find you and follow you and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, they can find me on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. Gil Martin author, and always want to talk about hockey and New York area hockey, Rangers Islanders hockey, Islanders Rangers hockey. And this rivalry, this book really was, for me, a labor of love, and getting to speak to all these players who I grew up rooting for or against, depending on, which team they played for. To me, it was a thrill and an honor. And I just enjoyed putting this together and remembering all these great moments and bringing them back for people.
Well, thank you for writing it. I really appreciate it. This is one of my favorite books. It's such a good compendium, and it really encapsulates, I think, as good as anything, what this rivalry is and what makes it so good. I think it's a celebration of the game, really. I mean, when you put together something like this, that means so much to so many people. It really is a celebration. What makes hockey in this town so great? And even though it's probably the fourth of the four major sports, I mean, this is as good as rivalry, I think, as anything on the planet. So thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. That's why I wrote this book, and hearing you say that sort of means that I must have done something right. So thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much for having me.
No, it was a pleasure. The pleasure was all mine. Do you have anything else that you want to promote? Do you have anything else coming up soon, or anything that you want to get out there?
Nothing imminent right now, but plenty of things that I'm going to start working on, and I'm very happy now that hockey is back for the new season.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. Again, Bill Martin, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight. But hey, when you make a second edition of the book, which I'm sure you will at some point, you definitely gotta come back and talk again. This was a blast. Thank you so much, man.
Be my pleasure. Thanks.